Alright, first video essay about Lolita. Great idea. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Anyways, why am I talking about Lolita? After all, it was released almost 65 years ago. Well, it remains one of the most highly read texts in universities and high schools today, and it is still highly relevant also. It's also probably one of the only books that was controversial when it was released, and is even more controversial today, thanks to movements such as Me Too and what came before it. Some people have read Lolita in some really anti-feminist ways, thinking of the protagonist Humbert Humbert as some sort of innocent victim to the succubus Dolores Haze. Other people have completely ignored the subject matter altogether, instead of only focused on the novel's eloquent use of the English language.
One of these interpretations is even quoted on the cover of one popular printing of the book, the only convincing love story of our century. Now, that quote on its own can be argued as a sarcastic statement, but when the entire Vanity Fair article it comes from is consulted, you'll find other gems throughout, such as, "Every passionate love can find its image in Humbert Humbert's boundless love for Lolita," and "Think of Lolita Haze's beauty while she is still a child, a naughty child admittedly, and her metamorphosis into plump, vulgar, ugly Dolly Schiller when she comes to the age of procreation." The article even begins by describing Humbert and Dolly's road trip as Lolita's lubricious trail across the soft underbelly of America, as if Dolores Haze is some sort of awful vampire snail leaving felled men in her slimy wake.
And this is far from the only interpretation of this sort. I'm not going to go through every single one, largely because they don't deserve it, but in her article, essayist Elizabeth Patno, PhD, outlines at least 10 different people who would agree with statements of this sort. So that means Lolita is capital P problematic, right? I mean, like in the 90s, there were not one, not two, but 3 different books that were written to try to reclaim Lolita in the 90s girl power way. There was Poems for Men Who Dream of Lolita, there was Lowe's Diary, and there was Roger Fishbite. Well, Lolita doesn't have to be problematic. Thanks to the author, we can interpret Lolita in any way we want. Nabokov didn't really write it in a cut and dried way anyways. We could think of it as this irredeemable pile of garbage, but some scholars have even swung the opposite way recently and started calling Lolita proto-feminist work. We can't really even be sure what Nabokov intended, because he always referred to the book as having no moral. And even if he had thought the book had a moral, then because of death of the author, then it doesn't really matter.
If we always had to stick with the author's intent as the true meaning of a work, and disregard any other meaning we got out of it, we would be forced to think that Tony Wiseau's The Room really is a harrowing tragedy of a good guy deceived by a cruel woman, instead of the unintentional comedic masterpiece that's recognized as today. Wiseau himself has even embraced this interpretation. After all, it did make him famous.
And I would argue that in order to teach Lolita in a classroom setting today, one must go into it with a feminist perspective. Otherwise, it just comes off as being like really gross and icky and just completely tone deaf. So I will be arguing that feminist perspective. I think that Vladimir Nabokov and even the character of Humbert Humbert add in so many subtle details that make it so Lolita can't just be taken as a tragic love story. Instead, Humbert Humbert is not the hero. Instead, Lolita herself is the hero. But Dolores Haze was also written so that she wasn't some sort of squeaky clean model heroine. It's just something that the 90s reinterpretations took to differing degrees. Throughout the book, Dolly makes many choices that the reader will disagree with, often forgoing the safer option for one that she deems preferable. She also just is not really a great person. She is rude and mean, and she lacks humanity in general. But in my opinion, these character flaws give Lolita a stronger message than it would have had if Dolly was a model feminist heroine. Let me explain that. But before I begin, let's get a few things out of the way. First, I'm assuming that everybody who's watching this video has read Lolita. If you haven't, well then, spoilers are ahead for this 65-year-old book. And if you haven't read Lolita, or you just want to get caught up on it, I suggest reading a summary somewhere online first before you watch this. I'm not been giving my own summary of Lolita because, frankly, it's just kind of a hard book to summarize, and also I don't want to make this video longer than it has to be, but I'll also not be discussing any of the film adaptations or any of the cultural effects that Lolita has had on society. If you are interested in those things, Miss Lola has actually made a great essay about those. So you should watch that video if you do want to have some knowledge about that stuff. But this video instead is for some hard-hitting literary analysis. Let's go.
Wait, objection!
Yeah, sorry.
How can we make any character judgments about Lolita? Humbert Humbert is one of the most famous unreliable narrators. How can we believe a word that comes out of his mouth?
Humbert Humbert isn't, really like love unreliable narrators and that,
Prove it!
Fine.
Part 1. Unreliable narration in Lolita. As I already alluded to, one of the foremost ways Humbert is described by people, other than as a pedophile, is as an unreliable narrator. This is a term that can be applied to any narrator who cannot be trusted, and who does not report the truth exactly as it happened. By this definition, this would make Humbert Humbert an unreliable narrator. I'm not trying to convince you otherwise. For example, he very often draws attention to the superficially beautiful things in his relationship with Dolly, and obscures the bad, such as her sobs in the night, every night, the moment he feigns sleep. Rather than going into detail about the abuse he inflicted on her, he instead comments on things such as the American landscape, describing how, beyond the tilled plain, beyond the toy roofs, there be a slow suffusion of inutile loveliness, a low sun in the platinum haze with a warm, peeled peach tinge pervading the upper edge of a two-dimensional dove-gray cloud fusing with the distant amorous mist. And if you read between the lines, you can see he's actually talking about Dolly there. He's always talking about Dolly, his Lolita. But Humbert would never admit to that. Like all narrators, he merely draws attention to some things over others, and interprets things in ways he sees fit. He only differs from other narrators in that he indulges in these things much more than the average one does. For example, when Charlotte Haze, Dolores' mother, leads him on a tour of their house near the beginning of the book, each part of it only gets a bland description. The dining room, the parlor, the mahogany table with a fruit vase in the middle. But when he sees Lo for the first time, he discusses her appearance and his reaction for an entire page or so. During this passage, he interprets Lo's appearance unfairly, comparing her to his childhood love, Annabelle Lee. He calls her the same child, the same frail, honey-hued shoulders, the same silky, supple bare back, the same chestnut head of hair. He describes every aspect of her body as if it is exactly like that of his old love, but even better, finishing off with, "The 25 years I had lived since her death tapered to a palpitating point and vanished." This is no doubt unreliable narration. Even though this Lolita looks a lot like Annabelle Lee did, she is obviously not a reincarnation of her. But notice that throughout the passage, Lo only kneels and looks at Humbert over dark glasses.
If this was a realistic movie, it wouldn't be out of place to have Lolita run up to Humbert here and embrace him, saying, "Where have you been all these years?" and for the viewer to know that this was just a fantasy. But Nabokov chooses not to do that. He instead just peppers the passage with Humbert's eloquent, flowery language, and leaves it at that. This is entirely intentional, though. As a narrator, Humbert Humbert just doesn't make things up whole cloth. Instead, he skews things to try to endear himself to the reader as much as possible.
For example, he presumably keeps other characters' speech largely intact, with Lolita saying many times how he raped her, and Charlotte saying outright just before she dies that Humbert is a monster, a detestable, abominable, criminal fraud.
If Humbert was just completely making things up, why would he make it so hard to condone his actions? Why doesn't he just make Dolores extremely supportive of whatever he does until she gets whisked away by the villainous Claire Quilty? Instead, by having a relationship that is obviously abusive from the beginning of part 2 until it ends. Why not make Charlotte like all his actions too? Why not make her still alive even? Why not just make it so that she just decides to randomly move to a different country for work or something, I don't know, and just leave the child with Humbert? Why does she have to die? It just doesn't make sense. If he did want to endear the reader to him, he would just be completely making things up. Really, for Humbert, all these things did happen. Things make a sort of logical sense in his world. B follows A. Of course, since this is just a fictional story, all this is entirely made up. But we can't just say that Humbert Humbert was making things up because of this. Ultimately, I think that people only really think of Humbert Humbert this way because that when they think of an unreliable narrator, that's not the most in-your-face description of one. Somebody who just skews things is a lot less prevalent than somebody who completely makes things up whole cloth.
People instead think of outright insane characters, or characters who actively want to invent complete fantasies for the audience. Examples of these characters include the narrator in Fight Club, Arthur Fleck in Joker, and Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects. This sort of unreliable narrator doesn't even have to be morally wrong, such as in the case of John Nash in Beautiful Mind, or Pi in The Life of Pi. Nabokov himself even employed a narrator who invented meaning when there was none in his later novel Pale Fire. This is the kind of narrator a reader often assumes Humbert Humbert is when he is referred to as unreliable. However, Humbert is quite different from them. While there is no definitive view on what separates narrators from one another, it's pretty accepted in everyday life that people can lie to different degrees. Saying, I ate a few french fries when he actually ate 3 bags of them, is quite different from saying, a dinosaur ate my 3 bags of french fries, and sincerely believing it. This is similar to how William Wrigham differentiates unreliable narrators in the 1981 book on them. The latter example, the more blatantly obvious lie, can be thought of as following the characteristics of the madman, who lives in their fantasy world, separate from our normal agreed reality. However, Humbert Humbert instead falls into the category of the liar, which is defined as being a mature narrator of sound cognition who deliberately misrepresents themselves, often to obscure their unseemly or discreditable past conduct. Humbert Humbert's reality is largely the same as our own, just with undue emphasis put on things that make him seem better. He never completely makes up anything. However, to argue this effectively, it is important to note that many things do conveniently work out in his favor, perhaps much more so than they would in the real world. But since this is a work of fiction, it seems fair that there is also a lower believability threshold. Accordingly, I will now be running through a couple of scenes from the book that seemed the most contrary to my claims, where people might instead point to Humbert being a madman and completely making things up. In doing so, I hope the distinction that may becomes more clear, and its importance becomes apparent.
As a case study, let us look to one of the most oddly told scenes in the whole book, the death of Charlotte Haze.
In this scene, beginning on page 95, Humbert is coming back to the Ramsdale house after procuring some sleeping pills from a doctor. He drives down the street the house is on, and then enters its front door, at which point he finds Charlotte at a desk, writing letters, wearing the same clothes as on the day she met Humbert. She is writing letters for various neighbors to explain the situation as to why Humbert will be leaving immediately, as she's discovered his diary entries concerning his attraction for her young daughter. Humbert leaves the room, and goes upstairs to find that his drawers have indeed been rifled through. He goes back downstairs, at which point he tells Charlotte they should be civilized, and he will make her a drink. After he makes the drinks, she doesn't answer his calls, at which point the phone rings, and a neighbor tells Humbert his wife has been run over by a car. He says that cannot be true, as he is just in the other room. When he opens the door, she is not.
At first, this scene seems to make entirely no sense. How could Charlotte have just disappeared if she was anything but a figment of Humbert's imagination? Why can Humbert not hold a true conversation with her? Why is she wearing the exact same clothes as she had when they first met? And can it really just be a coincidence that Humbert was driving a car before this whole scene happened?
When investigated further, however, everything actually does fall into place. Charlotte did not disappear. She only went out the front door while Humbert was making the drinks in the kitchen. It is described that Humbert is making a lot of noise. He opens the freezer, which roars at him viciously as he gets ice from it. Then the ice cubes themselves make rasping, crackling, tortured sounds as he pours water on them. The icebox barks and bangs as he closes it. He was focused so much on the drinks that he didn't hear her go out. She then only appears to disappear because he just assumes she is still in the room.
Granted, some of these verbs are pretty odd choices for this scene. Vicious barks, gasps, bangs. Might this just be the sounds that were heard when Humbert ran his car into Charlotte? Perhaps, but I will instead argue that they're just there to incite some confusion into the mind of the reader. Because really, Humbert does use a lot of odd word choices elsewhere in the book.
But the imagination needs to be stretched much more if this deduction is to be believed. Why the police not investigate Humbert at any time after this crash? What about the actual person that does cause the crash, who Humbert meets again later in the book? Why are the neighbors who witnessed the crash on Humbert's side? If Humbert really wanted to run down Charlotte in his car, he would have to have been going way too fast at the point of his journey back to the house, where he would normally be slowing down and going into his driveway. It would be extremely suspicious for him to somehow be at a great enough speed to cause serious bodily harm to Charlotte at such a point in his journey. It is more believable that there really was an accident.
More problematic than this scene, however, is the one that takes place at the end of part 1, at the Enchanted Hunter's Inn. You know, the one where Dolly seduces Humbert. How can a 12-year-old girl seduce a middle-aged man? Obviously, this was just rape, and Humbert is just trying to cover it up here. Well, it's true. Humbert did rape her. And also, depending on how you define the word seduce, Dolly did seduce Humbert. See? Scenes that can be interpreted differently, rather than things that are just made up whole cloth. But how can both be true? Well, let me explain that.
From the moment Humbert and Dolores begin their stay at the Enchanted Hunters, Humbert is determined that tonight will be the night where he rapes Lolita for the first time. He even drugs her with sleeping pills to accomplish this, trying to make her entirely defenseless. When the sleeping pills don't really work, and Lolita only sleeps normally, Humbert instead lies awake the entire time. He gets up every now and again to walk around or use the bathroom, but by the end of the night he is determined not to be a brutal scoundrel, so he lets Dolores rest unmolested. It is then, during the first minutes of the morning, that the scene in question occurs. Lolita wakes and looks at Humbert. Humbert regards her and strokes her hair. They kiss. Lolita pulls away, and then whispers into Humbert's ear what she would like them to do, repeating it a second time when Humbert doesn't entirely hear. Humbert feigns stupidity, and lets Lolita take the lead. But before he can get into the nitty-gritty details of the acts they perform, Humbert shuts off his play-by-play, saying that he has no interest in describing the stark acts that followed. Many ambiguities are left on the table. A section of Elizabeth Patnow's paper, Lolita Misrepresented, Lolita Reclaimed, disclosing the doubles, deals with this very scene. But Patnow, who earlier, if you remember, listed many male authors who would read the scene with vigor, doesn't try to completely discount Humbert's version of events. She doesn't try to postulate that Humbert actually did rape her at the first chance he got during the night, and that the scene was all just some kind of cover-up. There isn't any evidence for that, and saying that must have happened really doesn't have much credibility. There's enough text for her to discuss and decipher in this event anyways. Instead, Patnow suggests that Lolita's lesson, her goal, her game, her stark act, is not to have intercourse, but only to kiss and perhaps fondle. Patnow does not rule out Dolores being interested in sexual acts.
Dolores is in the midst of puberty, and people in puberty do generally find sexual things at least interesting to some degree. Though it is left ambiguous whether she kissed Humbert or not, she is at least attracted to him in some way. This is something that has been established. After all, she did put a magazine ad of a handsome man above her bed and scrawled HH beside it. She's definitely comfortable being with Humbert physically, because when she went on that shopping trip with Humbert and Charlotte, it was only because Humbert was there. Charlotte didn't want her to come in the first place. She even let Humbert lick her eyeball. Lick her eyeball?
It's right there. I can feel it.
Swiss peasant would use the tip of her tongue.
Lick it out.
Yes, shall I try?
Sure.
Goody goody, it is gone.
Now the other?
You dope. There is no... Okay.
Well, okay then. Let's move on. In our article, Elizabeth Patnow actually argues against any form of seduction by Lolita beyond just kissing and maybe some heavy petting, something I personally disagree with.
We get told in plain English later that Lolita personally witnessed copulation already, and even had sex prior to this point. I personally don't find it unbelievable that she wants to try out this erotic act with the person she currently finds most attractive, even though she doesn't have the capacity to fully understand this is the same thing even adults crave and use for procreation. But even if you agree with my assessment, you can also still agree with Patnow's in principle, as I do. She brings up the point herself that some readers insist that from the onset of the scene, Lolita wants to teach Humbert how to have intercourse, that she initiates and maneuvers penetration.
I don't know if it went down exactly like that, but whatever.
While I disagree with this interpretation, even it describes an essential double drama. If Lolita consents to or even appears to direct her painful penetration by Humbert, she does so with Humbert's powerful director's hand. As he leads her to believe she is in control, he controls her. He gets power by appearing to give up power, exerts his will by appearing to relinquish his will. Finally, even within this reading of Lolita as pseudo-director, he directs her to consent to activities that he maneuvers and for which he knows she is not prepared. And this consent is problematic. First, because it is not clear that Lolita does consent to intercourse, and because, within the power differential of the situation, it becomes impossible for Lolita, or for any 12-year-old, truly to consent to what is about to happen, to consent as an informed, independent, empowered person who has a variety of implementable options from which to choose. The act of sex between Humbert and Lolita undeniably gets out of hand, and goes past the point of consent. Throughout this passage, Humbert uses the word life as a metaphor for his penis, as in, my life was handled by little Lo in an energetic, matter-of-fact manner, as if it were an insensate gadget unconnected with me. In the next sentence, though, Humbert says that she was not quite prepared for certain discrepancies between the kid's life and mine.
We already know from a few pages later that Dolly had had sex by this point. She thought she knew what she had to expect. Instead, throughout the next few paragraphs, Humbert Humbert uses a variety of metaphors that instead illustrate that Dolly had no idea what was about to happen. Instead, she experienced a lot of pain throughout the Stark Act.
A tiger pursuing a bird of paradise, a choking snake sheathing hold a flayed trunk of a shoat, a callipygian slave child climbing a column of onyx, stinging red, smarting pink, a sigh, a wincing child.
This is clearly not a depiction of a consensual sex act. Even if Dolly had consented as much as any 12-year-old girl thinks she can, then she clearly stopped wanting to be involved in this very quickly. And Humbert Humbert himself even says that pride alone prevented her from giving up.
Therefore, we can conclude that Dolly seduced Humbert and then was raped by him.
Okay, well now that we've discussed the two scenes in the book that a casual reader would point to as being completely made up, we can begin discussing Dolores Haze's character and personality without thinking that we are just discussing some figment of Humbert's imagination. And what is that character and personality? Is it just that of a normal 12-year-old girl? Well, yes and no. Here is a transcript of every single line of dialogue Dolores Haze said in Lolita. If you're curious, it comes out to about 7 pages or so. Now, that might sound like a lot, but considering that the book has 309 pages, that's only around 2% of the text, give or take. And since we've already established that whatever Humbert Humbert describes we have to take with a whole heap of salt, this is the most that we have that is obvious, direct evidence to the claims that I'll be making. Though I will dip into some of Humbert Humbert's claims at some point when I think that they are like pretty plain descriptions or that they're defensible because of the words that are being said by Dolores. Still, I feel that even though this is only 7 pages, that Nabokov does really try to give Dolores a distinct character. And I feel that we can make a lot of character deductions from just these 7 pages. Let's get into the first one.
Dolly is rude.
She regularly insults people, and she doesn't care for any sort of form of common courtesy. Her first lines in the book are an unflattering description of her classmate Ginny McCoo.
Oh, she's a fright, and mean, and lame. Nearly died of polio. She later insults her own mother, telling her she stinks. She also seen running around unwashed and barefoot, stealing all of someone's bacon, barging in when she isn't supposed to, throwing tennis balls, and hitting people with shoe trees. Some of this doesn't come directly from dialogue, mind you, but the dialogue does more or less support it. Dolly even half-jokingly defines herself as bad, bad girl, juvenile delinquent but frank and fetching.
Now, the point of this description is not to rag on Dolly, and I assure everybody that there is a reason why I'm talking about this, and that reason will be discussed much later in the video. For now, let's move on to some of the other personality characteristics.
Dolly is frank.
As she said herself in the last point, Dolly knows what things are when she sees them, and she isn't afraid to say so.
She nonchalantly points out things such as, a squash squirrel, what a shame. This is a characteristic that is quite helpful to the reader when it comes to the book's more shocking content, as Dolly defines things without any of that Humbertian flowery filter. Multiple times she calls Humbert's conduct what it is, rape. I have to call the police and tell them you raped me. What was the name of the hotel where you raped me? Even before it happened, she knows that for any kind of sexual conduct between a father and daughter, related by blood or not, the word is incest. She can also recall when things were inappropriate at other times. When telling Humbert what she knew about sex before she met him, she says that Donald Scott, who was the dumbest boy in the school, had done it with Hazel Smith in his uncle's garage, and that Kenneth Knight, who was the brightest, used to exhibit himself wherever and whenever he had a chance. Much later in the book, she says that Claire Quilty wanted her to do crazy things, filthy things, and she said, "No, I'm just not going to blow your beastly boys."
So she is quite aware of how insane the situation she's in for much of the book is. Tying into these 2 points,
Dolly is strong-willed.
you kind of have to be to insult people and speak your mind, but it bears repeating.
You've again hurt my wrists, you brute, she says to Humbert at one point. Sometimes you're quite revoltingly dumb. Earlier, when Charlotte wants to shop with Humbert alone, Dolly insists that she is coming too. Wait, move your bottom, you. You can also see this in how she decides to make a move on Humbert in the hotel when he didn't do so for her.
That is, if you have been agreeing with me on that point. Anyways, she is strong-willed enough to even be able
To lie to people, to deceive. This is quite apparent in the last third of the book or so. When Dolly tells Humbert that she just feels like she now immediately wants to leave school and go for a long trip again, she says, "This time we'll go wherever I want," but she doesn't say why. In order to stop any potential questions, she puts a chair on top of everything by allowing Humbert to have sex with her at night, saying that she feels sort of romantic tonight. Of course, we know by the book's end that she took this trip only so she could run off with Claire Quilty instead. She makes numerous other lies during this time, saying the man she was talking to, Quilty, only had wandered if I had a map, and that he had just lost his way. She tells Humbert, ignore him. She also tries to lead Humbert away from Quilty altogether, when she tells him that Vivian is the male author of the play, the gal author is Claire. Finally, she makes up an entire story for where she was when she disappears with Quilty for a time. She was with a Beardsley girl, one that was not in her group. She was not in her school. She was just a town girl in Beardsley. She only knew her first name. They went to a drugstore. They had just a couple of Cokes. At least, she had. Dolly had a glass of water. When Dolly realizes the story just entirely won't work out, she finally settles on that the two of them just talked and looked at dresses in the show windows.
By the end of the story, while Humbert does believe he has been deceived in some way, Dolly has given him so many possibilities that he just has no way to know outright. And even though this deception might not have been successful, Dolly's larger one is. Despite all the clues that got dropped over the course of the trip as to the identity of their pursuer, Humbert never was able to figure it out until the end of the book when he meets up with Dolly again, where she finally reveals the name that the astute reader has guessed long ago. And she kept at it all the time, too. Even when she was sick in the Office-owned hospital, she told Humbert to give her all her clothes because then they could leave sooner. Really, when she wants to, Dolly Haze is a great fibber. Now, what is the point of me going through all these personality traits of Lolita? Well, it's kind of to show that she just isn't the model heroine. Anybody who wants to make her the protagonist of a book, such as Roger Fishbite or Lowe's Diary, has to entirely change her, or at least tweak her in some way. Roger Fishbite changed her character, and Lowe's Diary didn't do that, but instead it made her entirely unsympathetic. So, anybody who thinks that she can be the model heroine of a book is just kind of kidding themselves. For any tale that wants to stay true to the story, they won't find Dolly as some amazing, likable person when looked at from the other side. They'll probably be yelling at the pages more than finding some hidden triumphant yarn. If Dolly does have some goodness in her, she certainly isn't showing it in the pages. But that really isn't my main point here. Not at all. There are things that matter a lot more than Lolita's likability. And you may be thinking to yourself here, psh, I don't care about morals and manners. Who cares what Lolita did in this book when there were crimes being committed by Humbert Humbert? Whatever she did matters nothing to them. Besides, women need a strong-willed person to look up to, just like all the people who spoke out during Me Too. And if you are thinking that, I applaud you, because it does show the validity of being able to read Lolita as a feminist text. There are a lot of similarities between Dolly Haze and the women who spoke up during the Me Too movement. Not that the women were rude, mind you, or that they were mean and I don't like them or anything. It's just that both Dolly Haze and those women were beholden to an industry, and that is why they didn't speak up sooner. The women in Me Too didn't want to become outcasts, and only because of the current social climate were they able to speak up at the time that they did. And that is the same in Dolly Haze's case. Near the beginning of their first road trip, Humbert goes through this long monologue to Dolly that, despite coming from her abuser, is actually surprisingly apt in what it says.
Let us see what happens if you, a minor, accused of having impaired the morals of an adult in a respectable inn, what happens if you complain to the police of my having kidnapped and raped you? Let us suppose they believe you. A minor female who allows a person over 21 to know her carnally involves her victim into statutory rape or second-degree sodomy, depending on the technique, and the maximum penalty is 10 years. So I go to jail. Okay, I go to jail. What happens to you, my orphan? Well, you are luckier. You become the ward of a Department of Public Welfare, which I'm afraid sounds a little bleak. A nice grim matron of the Miss Phelan type, but more rigid and not a drinking woman, will take away your lipstick and fancy clothes. No more gadding about. I don't know if you've ever heard of the laws relating to dependent, neglected, incorrigible, and delinquent children. While I stand gripping the bars, you, happy neglected child, will get a choice of various dwelling places, all more or less the same. The correctional school, the reformatory, the juvenile detention home, or in those admirable girls' protectories where you knit things and sing hymns and have rancid pancakes on Sundays. You will go there, Lolita, my Lolita, This Lolita will leave her catalyst and go there, as the wayward girl you are. In plainer words, if we two are found out, you'll be analyzed and institutionalized, my pet say too. You will dwell, my Lolita will dwell, come here my brown flower, with 39 other dopes in a dirty dormitory, no, allow me please, under the supervision of hideous matrons. This is the situation, this is the choice. Don't you think that under the circumstances, Dolores Haze had better stick to her old man?
So, first of all, we must apply the whole heap of salt here that I was talking about earlier. This description contains a lot of gaslighting, in that it paints Humbert as the victim rather than Dolly. It also probably exaggerates how bad the protectories would be, and how preferable Dolly's current situation is to them. However, once we take away all of Humbert's skewing and weaseling, it still remains a fairly accurate description of Dolly's predicament. If she does tell the police about their situation, then it's true that Dolly doesn't have any other family. Maybe she does get really lucky, and she finds a great foster home immediately. But luck is not in her favor.
In 1945, around the time of the book's events, it was found that only 26% of adoptions were for children aged 6 to 13. If Dolly stayed in the system for a couple of years until she reached 14, her chances would go down even further to 12%. It also takes an average of 3 years for a child to get adopted, the much more recent statistics, meaning that if they can be applied to adoptions in the 1940s, it is quite likely that she gets to the older age category. Her general temperament wouldn't be much help to her either.
And this with Humbert entirely glossing over whether or not Dolly's believed in the first place, which at this time in the late 1940s is probably a huge hurdle, especially when Dolly goes up against Humbert's eloquence and old world charm. Even though Humbert describes this as terrorizing low, to the point that Dolly actually starts to sidle up with him during this monologue, it seems, it is actually kind of true that this is what would happen. But now, one must ask, so what? Anything's better than being by Humbert's side, right? I mean, that's what the rational adult mind would think. Unfortunately, Dolly just doesn't see it that way. And you may think that she would need to be, like, physically restrained or something to not run away, or at least told something else of why it would be a bad idea. And to that I say, there is no need. Just like all of those women who waited for many years to speak out, Dolly did the same. Because just like those women, there was an industry that Dolly was beholden to. And that industry was the consumerist American lifestyle.
Now, the evidence to this claim is somewhat more circumstantial than my last ones, but I do believe there is more than enough meat here to uphold it. When I say consumerist American lifestyle, I mean a lifestyle that tells people they can be valued by being consumers. You know, by buying fancy cars, clothes, ice cream, records, leisurely vacations, anything that shows what capitalism has gotten them, rather than being shouldered with the meager rations the commies in the Soviet Union have to scrape by on. Lo wants to live like the people in the magazines she reads. She wants to go with Carl and Al here to the roller skating rink, wearing blue jeans and white high shoes as most of the other girls did. She wants sweet hot jazz, square dancing, gooey fudge sundaes, musicals, movie magazines, and so forth. She wants to be involved in the conventional program, the stock pastimes, the things that are done, the routine of youth. For her own part, Dolly does describe herself as thrifty in a passing comment, and when she sees a car wreck with a woman's shoe lying in a ditch, rather than express sympathy, Dolly instead comments, "That was the exact type of moccasin I was trying to describe to that jerk in the store." Clearly, Dolly puts the ideal of American consumerist life higher than the average person. So if that is what's keeping her with Humbert, what makes her decide to escape in the first place? Well, to begin with, Dolly begins to get fed up with the extended road trip. She is desperate for any sort of human contact other than whatever abomination of she gets with Humbert, as evidenced by when she pleads with him after seeing a family from her hometown and in the distance. "Look, the McChrystos, please, let's talk to them, please, please! I'll do anything you want, oh please!" She also realizes that the ideal American life involves a sense of normalcy in it, and her life is anything but normal. How long did Humbert think they were going to live in stuffy cabins, doing filthy things together and never behaving like ordinary people, she asks. So Humbert acquiesces, partially due to his depleting funds, and Dolly is enrolled in Beardsley School for Girls. There, she manages to make a good number of friends. However, Dolly finds that she still isn't happy. Her teachers call her defiant and impossibly rude, friends and parties make her express the utmost disgust and exhaustion, and she even outright says that all this noise about boys gags me, even though boys are supposed to be one of the things defining an ideal American girl's life.
In other words, she discovers that the industry which she has been adhering to just entirely isn't worth it. And once she discovers that, there's no reason not to run away anymore.
Granted, she also decides to run away so she can be with Claire Quilty, but once she discovers that he wants her to do filthy things with people other than him, she has no problems drifting, doing some restaurant work in small places, and then finally sitting down with a seemingly old and sad half-deaf man, rather than some perfect fit specimen she would have come across in the media. When she writes to Humbert years later for money, she only asks for it so they can pay their debts and get out of the lower 48 altogether. Even when Humbert decides to give her 10 times the amount she proposed, she doesn't dream of any of the consumer goods she cared for years ago. She only remarks that it settles everything.
So that is why Dolores Haze made the awful decision to stay with Humbert Humbert for so long. We know it wasn't the right choice, but we aren't the ones calling the shots. A young girl is.
Part 3. Interpretations.
So, what does this all mean? Now that we've established Dolores Haze as an imperfect girl who's beholden to the consumerist American lifestyle, what points can we draw from it? Well, there are two that I'd like to make here. One of them is something that we can point to because it's emblematic of Nabokov's time and is very relevant to feminism of that time or before it. And the second is much more practical, something that is for the book's most unsavory readers.
Vladimir Nabokov published Lolita in 1955, in a time when America was at its height. World War II was over and the West had been victorious. Let freedom reign and capitalism prosper. Nuclear families are moving out to newly built suburbs in cities across the continent. And who do these nuclear families consist of? Why, your average American father, making more than enough money to support it, along with 2 or so beautiful children and a gorgeous, doting housewife. This was the prime time for the American dream. But Nabokov is not American. He grew up in Russia, attended college at Cambridge in England, lived in Germany before the breakout of World War II, stayed in France until the Nazis began to reach Paris, and only then settled in America with his family already well established. He had an outside perspective on everything that was going on, and as such, he had a fairly unique position on which to comment on the problems women faced in America during this time. Second-wave feminism didn't truly begin until the 60s, and first-wave feminism was mostly focused on equal voting and property rights. Most female suffragists during the first wave, which had ended over 30 years ago at this point, were upper-class women who actually were completely fine with being model housewives, as long as they were regarded as equals by the government, just as they believed they were equal with their husband in being influences to their children. There wasn't really any voice telling women that an option other than finding a man and supporting him through thick and thin.
This is definitely a gross oversimplification, but it is sort of true. And I find that you can really look at Lolita from a proto-second wave feminist standpoint pretty easily. And once you do, the book starts to look a lot like a satire. As I mentioned already, Dolores Haze is very enchanted by the idea of consumerism. And just like a 1950s woman, she doesn't have an income of her own in order to get the goods that she wants. So, like any 1950s woman, she has to find a man to get those goods for her. And she decides that when she does find this man, then she will marry him because that's what everything says that you should. And after she marries him, she has to pay a price for these goods, and that price is her body. And it doesn't really matter what the husband says, because that without the husband, then she can't live up to this lifestyle that she's dreamed of. It doesn't matter if he's rude or mean or anything. If she leaves him, then she'll be a divorcee. And the ideal American woman isn't a divorcee. Now is she?
Here's an interesting little snippet. Early in the novel, right after Dolly gets back from camp, she attempts to recite the Girl Scout law, which she had just learned. This is the Girl Scout law as it was written in 1920, the newest version on the books at the time. 1. A Girl Scout's honor is to be trusted. 2. A Girl Scout is loyal. 3. A Girl Scout's duty is to be useful and to help others. 4. A Girl Scout is a friend to all, and a sister to every other Girl Scout. 5. A Girl Scout is courteous. 6. A Girl Scout is a friend to animals. 7. A Girl Scout obeys orders. 8. A Girl Scout is cheerful. 9. A Girl Scout is thrifty. 10. A Girl Scout is clean in thought, word, and deed. and this is Dolly's approximation of it. The Girl Scouts' motto is also mine. I fill my life with worthwhile deeds such as, well, never mind what. My duty is to be useful. I'm a friend to male animals. I obey orders. I am cheerful. That was another police car. I am thrifty, and I am absolutely filthy in thought, word, and deed.
Here, Dolly explicitly points out every quality that she believes still applies to her, and cuts out every one that she believes doesn't have to apply to her anymore. It is definitely noticeable that she chooses to leave in thrifty, as was mentioned earlier. Of course, the last point is an obvious joke at her own expense, but I do feel that she sincerely means mostly everything else that she says. In fact, she even adds in filling her life with worthwhile deeds, which isn't even part of the Girl Scout law, promise, motto, or slogan. Yeah, the Girl Scouts do have a lot of things. Of course, it bears mentioning that even though Dolly wants to have these worthwhile deeds, she doesn't even know what they are. This is because that this is supposed to be emblematic of a woman's place in 1950s society, because it was very much their role to just wait around and support people until something came up that required their best. It is also notable that Dolly chooses to keep in being useful, obeying orders, and being cheerful, but she chooses to cut out being honorable, being loyal, and being courteous. And this is because that it doesn't matter if she doesn't have the latter three qualities if she listens to her man and obeys orders. She won't need those other qualities in the first place because she wanted to think for herself. It is definitely notable as well that she chooses to keep in friend to animals, but she changes that to friend to male animals. This is almost certainly a bit of a joke, this time at the expense of boys her age, but still, it says something that she wants to be a friend to these animalistic young men.
The illusions of domesticity are only cemented in the next few sentences, when she chooses to point out how, over the swimming and other activities she later reveals she did much of, that the girls baked in the reflector oven and washed zillions of dishes. Even when Dolly decides to give up searching for the ideal lifestyle of female 1950s American, a non-ideal housewife lifestyle is still what she chooses in the end. She rejects the polyamorous fantasy life of Claire Quilty and chooses to live with well-meaning Dick instead, getting pregnant in short order and deciding to run away with him to the ends of the earth. At the beginning of the book, it is revealed this ultimately led to her dying in childbirth, just days shy of her 18th birthday. It is perhaps a grim reminder by Nabokov that even when the ideal is abandoned, the alternative lifestyles available to women at this time were not much better.
Speaking of reminders, here's what I'd like to put forward my second interpretation of Dolly's character in Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita. As already mentioned, Dolly is rude and frank, and willing to do whatever it takes to stay in Humbert Humbert's good books, lest the alternative befalls her. This personality earns her few friends, and the friends that she does have, she seems to treat more like status symbols or ways to have fun than people she can rely on. She also is well versed in sex matters, as well versed as any 12-year-old can be. Even before Humbert rapes her, she also has no family other than Humbert, nobody to care when she disappears from her hometown and never comes back to it. Humbert himself also has loads of cash, and he never has to work a day again in his life. What's the point of all this, though? The point of it is that the situation was perfect for Humbert to take a girl away and rape her and do whatever he wants with her for as much time as he wanted to. There was no better girl, there was no better time, and there was no better place. There were no other pesky adults to pry into their situation and try to get Lolita away, or no life obligations to take Humbert away for even a little bit and give Dolores the opportunity to know a life outside the four corridors and the zillions and zillions of motel rooms. But when everything was said and done, it just didn't matter. Dolores still died in childbirth, and Humbert still died awaiting trial. This outcome was predicted from the moment that Humbert stole her away, because the same characteristics that Dolores had to make it so that she was the perfect victim eventually made it so that she could escape. This is the message that Lolita is telling any deviants who want to take away a girl like Lolita. She will die, and you will too. This is not a book for your male fantasies. This is an account of what happens when a girl listens and internalizes the misogyny that is told to her, and she does what it says she should. This really is one of the most powerful and most subversive pieces of feminist literature ever created. And really, what's best of all is that every man has already read it. Thank you all for listening. Good morning, good evening, and good night. So, yeah, that was my first video essay. Thanks to everybody for watching it. And yeah, I decided to make it on Lolita because Lolita is one of my favorite books of all time, and I wanted to just make something that I felt would be able to put my understanding of Lolita into other people's minds and show how it really can be a work that people still read in 2020 and appreciate and whatever, because I took a university course not too long ago, and it felt that most people can only talk about the book in the way that it was just like a good way to show how you could make anything beautiful with language and with English writing. And while that's like a really good thing to show people, and it's definitely interesting, it's also something that I feel that is not fully exploring Lolita as a book, since it's a really, really deep book. You can read it in so many ways, and it's just so interesting. Like, you could read it from the way I did, from like this feminist perspective. You can read it from a totally misogynistic perspective so many other people have, or like you could read it from a totally different thing, like completely out of left field. Like, I was looking at some of Edgar Allan's Poe's works, and I realized that Humbert Humbert talks a lot like the characters in Edgar Allan Poe's works do, but so maybe Nabokov wanted to say something about Poe's works and put them in the 20th century, and you could make a whole other thing about that, but that's neither here nor there, and it was not worth putting in this video. And yeah, so anyways, whatever I said in this video, it is not the definitive feminist viewpoint. I should say that. I'm a man, and I feel like even if I was a woman, I would not be able to put down the one feminist viewpoint. There are many viewpoints in general that you can have on this, and this is just my own. And if you agree with it, then that's great, and I'm glad that you do. And if you disagree with it, well, then that's fine too. And if you want to, you can leave a comment down in the description, and maybe I'll reply to you and stuff. So this essay was on a book, and I'd love to do more essays on books, but this is one of the only books that everybody has read. It's like, there isn't really a canon of books like there used to be like 200 years ago or whatever, and that's kind of a good thing, because it's kind of silly that there would have to be one stack of books that everybody has to read in order to be a cultured person or whatever. So I'm fine with that. It's just that for a mass market audience like YouTube, there aren't many books that I think that I've read that everybody else has also read. So this probably would just be the one video that I make on a book, unless people can convince me otherwise, that there's some other book that everybody has probably read and that's also deep enough to have a video essay subject on. So with that in mind, I think that I'm going to actually, in my next video essays, I'm going to do more stuff about movies and anime and like other things that I just find interesting. Yeah, I only really started this channel because of the quarantine, and we'll see how many of these videos that I make in quarantine. Hopefully I make a bunch, and it'll be cool and whatever. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel, because knowing that people want to watch more videos like this and enjoy what I make is the thing that will encourage me the most to make more videos like this. So yeah, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and have a good day.